Okay, well, good morning to everyone and welcome to a program of the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm Kent Lassman, and today we're pleased to release Free to Prosper, a pro-growth agenda for the 117th Congress. This book is a compendium of specific proposals for lawmakers, and taken together, the agenda offers a practical guide for federal legislative priorities. It's past time for Congress to reclaim its place in our constitutional structure and to make room for entrepreneurial activity all across the nation. In just a moment, I'll be joined by Senator Rand Paul from the Commonwealth of Kentucky, and later by three of my colleagues, Research Fellow Sean Higgins, Senior Fellow Ryan Young, and Vice President for Strategy, Iain Murray. Now, a couple of administrative notes before we dive into the program. This event is being recorded, and it will be made available on our website and at YouTube. Among the registered guests for the live program are members of the media, and everything we say is on the record. Now, part of my role today is to encourage your participation. So if you have questions, please use the Q&A function found at the bottom of the screen or send an email to events@cei.org. And very importantly, for the media, please include your full name and the name of your publication. All other questions will be presented with a first name only. Now, to get a better feel for what's happening in our nation's legislature, we're joined now by Senator Rand Paul. He's been in the US Senate for a decade, and rare among his colleagues, he's carved out a leadership niche in foreign policy, domestic and economic policy, and on constitutional questions. He's with us today to share his ideas on the current Congress and our Free to Prosper pro-growth agenda. After remarks and taking some questions, we'll transition to the second portion of the program with my colleagues. Now that I've gotten all of that out of the way, Rand Paul, it's good to see you again. Welcome back to the Competitive Enterprise Institute. Senator, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you. It's great to be with the Competitive Enterprise Institute. We're always looking for allies and friends among the movements outside of the legislature that are for, less regulation, less interference in the economy, for trade, for limited constitutional government. And I often lament we need more allies and we need stronger, louder allies, particularly when in the minority. Sort of a good news, bad news scenario we've got now. I think you all know the bad news. The bad news is the party that is for big government deficits and excessive regulation is in charge of House, Senate, and the presidency. But the good news is that capitalism is amazingly resilient. And there are good long-term trends that go above and beyond each election. I'm not saying it's not important. It's incredibly important because over time, a country can gradually devolve into socialism. It can gradually run away from capitalism. So elections are incredibly important, but I think the resilience of the economy is a story that's sometimes underappreciated. When we look at the long-term trends, and I think humanprogress.org is a good organization for looking at some of the long-term trends. Back at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, basically you had almost everybody lived a subsistence level. They lived in extreme poverty, less than $2 a day. You look at that in constant terms, the only people that had enough food were the royalty. Obesity was an unknown thing other than the royalty because everybody else scrounged around for food. That went on for a long period of time. But the Industrial Revolution, as it came forward, Adam Smith was proved to be incredibly prescient. He talked about the division of labor. He talked about international trade, and he talked about capitalism. And what he said was that it would bring about marvelous things, and lo and behold, it did. We go through, sort of the early 19th century, and you get to when I'm born in the early 1960s, instead of 98% of people living in extreme poverty, about a third of the world did. So we improved dramatically, lessening poverty and going forward because of capitalism, because of trade, because of the division of labor. We fast forward through my lifetime, we've gone from a third of the people living in extreme poverty to under 10%. It's about 9%. This includes the entire world. We're talking about Bangladesh, India, China, US, everybody all mixed together, less than 10% living in extreme poverty. That is an amazing story. The downside is this, is that it's an untold story, and it's a story that is not fully comprehended as to how it came about. Some people think it's just an accident. If you go to Silicon Valley, they think They're just really smart, and smart people will create things no matter what the economic system is. And it really is not true. It is very, very dependent on the economic system. And if you want to see an example, which I'm sure all of you are aware of, is just look at a country that has amazing resources, amazing people, a history of intellectual development like Venezuela. And they've gone from having more oil reserves than Saudi Arabia, which I think they do, to people roaming the streets and eating their pets. My wife and I wrote a book about a year ago called The Case Against Socialism. And in that, we opened the book by talking about a young lady who's a gang member, but her gang defended like 4 dumpsters from other people so they could scrounge for the food scraps in there. There were stories of people literally killing their pets. Their dollar or their currency went to virtually being worthless, over a several-year period. It started out, 10% annual inflation, then 20, then 100, then 1,000. Now they're in a 1,000-fold sort of inflationary spiral at this point. And it's been a disaster for the people. They've shown that price controls once again lead to shortages and famine. And if you look for things like obesity, the only obesity left are if you're a friend of the dear leader. So there still is a top 1%, but the top 1% get food in Venezuela. They don't necessarily get opulence, but they get food, and everybody else is scrounging for food. This is incredibly important when we talk to this next generation of voters. We're losing these voters to socialism and to the Democrat Party, and anymore, there's not really a difference. The Democrats are now openly admitting to and saying they are avowing that they are socialists. But we're losing young people to this because they don't quite get and understand what's going on, that it is socialism is the problem. They tend to want to individualize it. Ana Navarra, who's on The View, a program I recommend not ever going on ever again. I was on with her and she's yelling and screaming at me that Maduro, Chavez, they're murderers, they're murderers. And I was like, yes, and socialists. Get the and in there, murderers and socialists, because that was the point of my book. The point of my book is that perhaps there is an inevitability or an inexorable link between socialism and thuggery, between socialism and authoritarianism. Because if we don't draw this link and we don't explain the link, we get this group of young people who say, well, Stalin and Pol Pot and Mao, these were accidents of history. Hitler and Castro and Maduro and Chavez, these were all just accidents of history. And we just got unlucky. But if we had a kinder, gentler form of socialism, it would all work. If Bernie Sanders were the dear leader, that we'd get democratic socialism. And I think the inevitability, the inexorability of the link between the two was summed up many, many years ago. People say, why do you write a book, The Case Against Socialism? Mises and Hayek and these famous people we won that battle. Well, I think we did intellectually, but now we're losing it to another generation who's not reading Hayek or Mises and Adam Smith and really don't understand the history of capitalism. But in order to get through to these people, we have to explain to them that there isn't a kinder, gentler form of socialism. And that, as Hayek and others wrote, that if you want complete socialism, if the goal is complete socialism with complete ownership of the means of production, including the land, people eventually resist. Sort of like we live in a world now where we resist by voting against those who want to regulate or interfere in our business. But as it gets worse and worse, as they come to take your land, your house, your money, or take one of your children, then people do resist, and they resist in a physical way to this grab by government. But as they do, socialism then selects for the person who is the most ruthless. Because if you're the kinder, gentler dictator, it's hard to take that last bit of land. It's hard to take, imagine, when Dr. Zhivago comes back to his house, and there's 4 families living in his house and they're cutting up the food for furniture, cutting up the furniture for fuel. You can see how at some point there is a resistance. And so what selects for is the more democratic or the more caring or considerate dictator doesn't evolve. It always devolves to the ruthless dictator, because that's how you get the property. Frankly, when people resist, you've got to be a good dictator. You got to be good at dictating. You got to be good at confiscating. And we need to make sure that this link between violence and authoritarianism is out there and they know it. The other thing we addressed in the book is the idea that Scandinavian socialism is also a benign, kinder, more gentler form of socialism. And we make it very clear in the book that one, Sweden's not socialist, Denmark's not socialist. They have private property. Murray Rothbard tells the story of when he asked Mises one time, he said, what's the one thing you have to have? Even if you're missing a million other things and the government's all over your economy, what's the one thing you still have to have to denote a capitalist society? And he said a stock exchange. And a free stock exchange with private stocks of companies being traded in private property, but basically a stock exchange. Sweden's had a private stock exchange for 150 years. They've had private property. Now, it's not to argue that they're a perfect paradise, but they're just not socialism. So if Bernie says that's the socialism he wants, he needs to examine the socialism there. Because one of the things about Sweden and Denmark and these Nordic countries is they actually have very high taxes on the working class and the middle class. Bernie says he doesn't want to tax the middle class and the working class. Oh, he just wants to tax the top 1%. Well, it doesn't work that way in these countries. If you want a welfare state, a massive welfare state, they do have in Sweden and Denmark, then if Bernie wants that and he wants to follow their model, he's going to have to understand that they tax the heck out of everybody. 25% sales tax, 60% income tax starting at 60,000. So they have incredible taxes over there. They're not socialist, but they are very, very high tax welfare states. But interestingly, some of the things that Bernie wants, they don't have over there. Bernie wants a high corporate income tax back. So does Biden, frankly, and I think we're going to get it. We went from 35% down to 21%. Democrats are advocating at least a 28%. Well, that's not what they do in Sweden or the Nordic countries. They've had it in the low 20s for 20, 30 years. Even when they flirted with socialism, they really didn't go up on their corporate tax that much. But the things he's for, they're not for there. Minimum wage. They don't have minimum wage in most of the Nordic countries. They have a more open labor market. Wealth tax. The Swedes tried a wealth tax, and most of the people left. If they had money and had a choice, they went somewhere else. It's actually very apparent in Europe. If you have a differentiation between taxes, now that they have the European Union, you're pretty much free to go anywhere else in the European Union. So it helps. They have a little bit of what we had under federalism and still have to a certain extent that some states are better places to live. Frankly, you can think of the no income tax states as places that people are going when they escape escape California or escape Illinois or New York. They're going to the low income tax states. The same thing happens to a certain degree in Europe as well. But as we look forward, the biggest battle we have isn't always just the next election. Politicians like to say, this is the most important election of my lifetime. And it's usually the most important election of their lifetime because they're concerned about their election. But it's really what's important are the ideas. And I appreciate that the Competitive Enterprise Institute is involved in ideas and has scholars, because you have to win the idea before you win the argument. You have to win the ideas before you win the political debate. And that ammunition is what we need. And we particularly need it presented to a younger crowd. I think the other way we may appeal to a younger crowd is that they may not be traditionally conservative, but they may lean a little libertarian. They may be live and let live. I don't care what other people do in their personal lives, and they may want more of that. So I think having a little more of a libertarian influence helps us to attract young people who become more conservative monetarily as they accumulate some money. But when they're just out of the household, they're used to socialism where mom and dad give them everything. And so they're not as inclined to be as conservative, I think, monetarily until they get some money of their own and they begin working. But I think eventually come to us. But I do think that looking towards the future, the most important thing for us to do is in education of the youth, continuing to combat the bad ideas in the daily struggle against socialism, and to not give in, not give up. But I do appreciate the work Competitive Enterprise Institute is doing, and I'll be happy to take a couple questions if we have time.
Wonderful. Before I get to our first question from the audience, I want to pick up on that. You've talked a good deal about the youth and presenting and selling these ideas. Ultimately, there's two ways of organizing social institutions. You can do it through coercion and telling people what to do and what they're allowed to do or not do, and you can do it through private cooperative action. Many folks, through survey data and other evidence-based data, see the younger generation, the generation coming into the labor force, as much more communitarian, much more leaning on that cooperative, get together and solve problems in a private sphere sort of attitude. Is that what you see? And do you see that as an opening to push back against some of the big government coercive mandates that we see so often coming out of the United States Senate or other bodies?
I think it's a great way to pose the question because when we oppose a big government program that's supposed to do something good for people, we oppose it often because it doesn't work or because it takes away freedom or because there's a private alternative to it. But we don't do as good a job at, I think, explaining, that there are other ways and that we do care about the people that are having trouble. A good way to think about this is with healthcare. The left says healthcare is a right and everybody should have government, Medicare or government kind of insurance. And, I respond that it's not a right, but that I do have an obligation. I'm a Christian and I believe I am my brother's keeper. And I believe I have an obligation to take care of the poor. As a physician, I practice that way. In fact, the tradition of hospitals was always that the only way the hospital let you work there is that you also had to take care of the poor. And we still charge people, but if someone came into the emergency room with a broken arm, there hasn't been a time in the history of the modern world that their broken arm wasn't fixed. Always has been. If they've got a piece of metal in their eye, I was an ophthalmologist, I'd go in and take the metal out of their eye, regardless of whether they could pay. And we did prefer paying patients, but we did take care of the poor, and you feel an obligation to that. But I think you're right that we don't express that we actually are for helping our fellow man, and we're against the government doing one because they don't do it efficiently and because they take away our freedom. Another way of putting this to young people that I like to do is I say, look, if you had $100 right now, would you give it to how do you think you could best help people? Giving it to the Salvation Army or giving it to HHS in Washington? And nobody in their right mind thinks giving $100 to anybody in government would be a good idea because they just don't do anything very well. And so I think arguing that private charity is more efficient at helping and feeding, clothing the homeless and those who don't have enough food. And anybody who's ever seen charity knows that private charities actually do work in a much better way than government does. And government's often counterproductive in the sense that they give a bunch of stuff, but in the end, the people get stuck in a trap where in some ways they're disincentivized to going out and finding something could even a better way of life because they're in this sort of trap of welfare. But I think you're right that the argument's more difficult. And one way it's more difficult also for us in a sales pitch to people is that what we're selling is opportunity and an abstraction. What the other side is selling is something concrete, and they're going to hand it to you. They're going to give you a cell phone, a government, or as they used to call them, an Obama phone. You'd get an Obama phone or two Obama phones. Then maybe you got a trailer, you got a house, you got an apartment, you get free college. All these things sound good, but we have to get people to think long enough to say, is anything in life really free? And I think that's where it comes in. And most people forced to think through secondary consequences will say, yeah, no, really, maybe it isn't really free. I kind of still like the free money, but it's like the stimulus. You poll Republicans, 70% of them love the stimulus. They love all the PPP money. It's like people say, how can I oppose this stuff? Because everybody wants it. It's like, well, because we're going to destroy the country. We're going to destroy the currency because I don't want a $1 trillion Zimbabwe note to put in my fireplace to burn for warmth. But it's a hard argument. Their argument is always inherently easier because they're going to offer you something immediate, something concrete, and we're offering something more tangential, something more less concrete, and it's opportunity. So we have to be better at selling ours than others. And it's actually remarkable that we've lasted this long. And that's the question: can it last? Where the majority of people can eventually vote themselves their own largesse. Can we resist the temptation to want something for nothing? And that's the real argument. That's what we need. Great debaters. We need great ideas and great ammunition. And we got to work hard on the other side if we want to try to win.
Our first question from the audience picks up on some of those concrete proposals. It's about your colleagues from New Jersey. Freda asks, which Democratic senators do you think will vote against the $15 minimum wage, the Green New Deal, and other progressive policies? If none, what do you think we can do to stop these proposals?
That's a good question. Right now, if we don't abolish the filibuster, and if they are disallowed from putting these on a budget reconciliation bill, they won't win because they need 60 votes. They need 10 Republicans. If they use the nuclear option and get rid of the filibuster, then they can do it with 51 votes, and the 51st vote is the Vice President, Kamala Harris. So really, it all depends on something that's out of our control now. There are two senators on the Democrat side who say that they're not for getting rid of the filibuster. But at least one of them has been tempering his opposition lately, Manchin, and saying, well, he's kind of against it unless it has to do with voting rights. And to them, voting rights means federalizing the election and really getting rid of in-person voting, which a lot of us worry will lead to a lack of integrity in the election. But if they say, well, we're for the filibuster except for when we can't win, that's not really much of a filibuster. So we'll see what happens. Nobody knows. People are very concerned about the Democrat voting bill federalizing the election and that it will transform things over time. People are also concerned about creating new states with a simple majority as well. So the filibuster is our friend. And that's why even under Trump, when we had House and Senate, I was still for the filibuster. And so were several other Republicans, not all of them. But the filibuster is good in the sense that, unfortunately, politically generated ideas, there's often more bad ones than good ones. And so stopping easy passage of legislation is probably good for the country.
Senator, I believe the most recent message I got came from your staff, which is an indication that you now have an 11:30 vote. So before we lose your attention, let me ask you if you want to say a couple words about two topics that we will be picking up in the second half of the program, legislation on right to work and legislation, the Reins Act, the way we regulate and how we monitor and account for that regulation. Both of these things I know are important to you. Do you want to use those as a closing remarks or a chance to go out?
The Reins Act, I inherited from Jim DeMint. He was the lead co-sponsor when he was here. I'm not sure if it was originally his idea or if anyone claims authorship to it, but I think in general, a lot of people, including myself, have said that most regulations are written by unelected bureaucrats, and that the problem in Washington is that bills are written and they're basically an outline of what a bill could be, and then the outline is filled in by the bureaucrats, and that's what becomes the law. A good example of this was Obamacare. Obamacare had 1,500 references to the Secretary of State, Secretary of Health shall decide at a later date. So people wrote the law at a later date who were not elected to write the laws. And this is a mistake of Congress giving too much power. But we've been doing it not only to bureaucrats, but to sort of semi-independent agencies, EPA, OSHA, all of this alphabet soup. And so now we have, I think over 100 regulations each year that are estimated to cost the economy over $100 million. Well, our bill, the Reins Act, says that if someone writes a regulation from some agency that is estimated to cost $100 million, that bill has to be sent back to Congress. We have to vote on it in order to approve it. And then the president has to sign it to make it a law. I think this makes eminent sense and would really make us think through what each of these regulations cost and analyze what are both benefits and the losses to these new regulations. I think it would transform the way government is done. And we used to have one Democrat on board. It's mostly a Republican bill on both sides. Manchin at one time was a co-sponsor, but I don't think he currently is. It'd be nice to get him back on board. But right now he's sort of, at the top, and people are all begging and pleading for him to go one way or another. So I don't know if we have much chance on the Reins Act, but that'd be something for your members, if they're interested in the Reins Act, would be to write to Manchin asking him to co-sponsor it again. On right to work is a great example at the state level of how federalism really works. People pick and choose individually to go to states with low income tax, but they also pick and choose their companies to go to states that have right to work. And Boeing was a great example when it went from Washington State to South Carolina. There are many automobile manufacturers that went either Kentucky or to Alabama and different places. So I think there's a lot of examples. If you look at overall, I think right to work states are, several points higher in GDP growth than non-right to work states. We have national legislation that would be a national right to work law. And interestingly, it doesn't create new law. It just goes back to some of the labor laws from the 30s and 40s and gets rid of a few passages, but basically gets rid of federal law that sort of allows or helps the ability to fire people who don't choose to join the union. So I think, unfortunately, it's a fairly Republican heavy bill as well. So both Reins Act and Right to Work are Republican heavy. And it used to be there were some Southern conservative Democrats that might get on board on either one. Some of that changed over time because the Southern conservative Democrats were replaced with Republicans. But now some of those Republicans are now being replaced not with conservative Democrats, but with very progressive Democrats. So you think of Georgia, where you went to moderately conservative Republicans were replaced with two very woke out there progressives. And so these are two, I think, aspirational pieces of bill: national right to work and the Reins Act. And absolutely, we keep advocating for them. Sometimes it takes a long time to get something passed up here, but it's something that we advocate for in case we can ever take over, House, Senate, and presidency again.
Very good. Thank you, Senator, for being with us. I appreciate the work that you're doing, and we'll look forward to having you back. With that, we're going to turn the program now to CEI Research Fellow, Sean Higgins. He is focused primarily on labor and employment law. We just heard the Senator talk about that, and its relationship to a resilient economy, what it takes to put back to work some 10 million people who have gone out of the workforce in the past year. The right to work bill that Senator Paul talked about would affect not just the 27 states that have a right to work law, but all of America. At this time, I want to turn to Sean and ask him to give us a little bit more detail on not only right to work, but our proposals for labor and employment. Sean?
Thank you, Kent. Legislation doesn't get much simpler than Senator Paul's National Right to Work Act. It's just 2 pages that say private sector unions and management cannot collude to take money away from workers. It's the type of thing where a person might wonder, wait, that's not already illegal? The answer is it depends on where you live. It is currently legal in 23 states, as well as Washington, D.C., for businesses and private sector unions to collude and sign a contract that says all workers must either join the union or pay the regular fee or else lose their job. This practice may soon be legal in all states, however, stripping workers in 27 of an important right, the right to decide for themselves whether they want to belong to a union. The Senate is set to take up the Protecting the Right to Organize Act, which would, among other provisions, prohibit states from having so-called right to work laws. The PRO Act's chances hinge on whether Democrats can remain unified and whether the filibuster remains. Senator Paul's legislation shows us that there is another way, that we can expand rather than contract the rights that workers are granted. It's a debate we need to have. The workforce is rapidly changing, and over the last year, Mother Nature has applied one hell of an accelerant to that process, forcing workers and businesses alike to experiment in a number of ways, like telecommuting and Zoom meetings. Like it or not, we will never completely return to the way things were before the pandemic. In the future, work will be more decentralized, with more people living at home, having less connection to their ostensible employers, and more opportunities to do freelance work. It's a situation that cries out for more freedom and flexibility. The laws need to keep up with this change. Whatever its faults in other areas, the prior administration tried to make the necessary adaptations through things like clarifying the difference between independent contractors and traditional employees, and giving management and workers more freedom to set schedules. Lawmakers like Paul are trying to do the same, enhance the rights of individual workers to have more control over how and when they work, and make it possible for them to have a decent living doing that. All the National Right to Work Act would do is say that workers cannot be forced to join an organization or have their pay taken away by a group they don't wish to be a member of. That's all. It's an expansion of individual worker rights. Any attempt to roll back right to work laws is a limitation on workers' rights. Unions and their supporters are quick to say that workers want to join unions. It's just that outdated laws and unscrupulous businesses prevent them. If that's truly the case, then they have nothing to fear from right to work laws because they do nothing to prohibit a worker from joining a union if that is what they want. In fact, even in right to work states, workers typically have to be proactive and affirmatively opt out of supporting the union. They typically have to renew that declaration annually. Unions are not held to the same standard. They usually don't have to, for example, hold periodic elections to determine if workers still support them, even in cases where work sites had 100% turnover since the union was first recognized. Unfortunately, the current administration and many in Congress have a different view. The new emerging forms of work and business must be made to conform to rules first set in place nearly a century ago. Workers need to be forced to go along with this for their own good. Never mind that rideshare app companies took off because people found them preferable to traditional cab companies, goes the thinking. Let's force them to operate exactly like cab companies. Never mind that many workers prize the ability to set their own hours and work when they want. Let's fix it so they don't have that freedom anymore. If they want to work, they have to do it for business that will control their schedule. Never mind that operating a branded franchise is a tried and true way for a person from a low-income background to become an entrepreneur. Let's make the corporations that franchise their brands legally responsible for the privately owned, independently run businesses that rent out the brand. So what if this makes franchising a treacherous risk corporations may not want to do any longer? Never mind the workers' right to privacy. Let's legally require employers to give away all their contact information if a union comes calling, and let's not give the workers any say in this. All this and more is what is in the PRO Act. One benefit of the coming attempt to pass the PRO Act is that it might force a debate on these very issues. Thankfully, we have people like Senator Paul to make the case for more freedom, not less.
Sean, before I turn to Ryan Young, I just want to rewind the tape for 30 seconds and ask you to expand upon, maybe for just a moment. There's a provision in the core Democrat legislative proposal on labor, the PRO Act that you referenced, that compels the distribution of private information of workers. If they don't subscribe to the idea that their personal information, their address, their phone number, their email should be given away, the law would make it possible and compel that information would be given away to prospective organizing unions. Is that right? Do I understand that the law takes away the ability to take care of your own private information?
That's the essence of it. I mean, what it really does is it says that employers have no ability to withhold any of this information, and the individual employee is basically cut out of the process. They have no way of establishing that they don't want this to be given away, and if they were to go to their employer and request that not given away, they'd have to be turned down by the employer because the law says they have to give it away. Typically, they're not even going to be told that this is happening. If they do happen to know about it and request that it not be done, again, they don't have it. The premise behind this is that unions needed to be able to effectively organize and reach all the workers. But then the question is, if the worker wants to be in a union, wouldn't they simply be volunteering this information to the union itself? Why does it need to be this sort of way? And you can sort of argue some of the points about, whether or not workers are alerted to this, but they can always just simply be contacted by, coworkers at their work site or by other means. The fact that their private information has to be given away is a striking feature of a lot of these type of quote unquote reforms, but it's usually in there.
Okay, highly coercive and just slipping by without much notice. So I'm glad that you were able to explain that for us. Let me turn to one of our regulatory economists, Ryan Young. He's been tracking the regulatory state, developing proposals for how we can get our arms around it, contain it, and bring it back in line with the Constitution. Ryan, could you pick up with some of the proposals in the new agenda for Congress and what it would do to rebalance the executive branch and the legislative branch? I'll note straight out of the gate, in the first couple of weeks, fortnight, President Biden signed more executive actions at a rate of 2 to 1 compared to President Trump or Obama. Do we even need a legislature anymore if we have executives taking this sort of lead in our constitutional republic?
Thanks, Kent. Yeah, the separation of powers is out of whack, and it has been for a long time. It's not a red team, blue team issue. It's a structural issue in the government. The executive branch for a long time now has become far too powerful relative to the legislative branch. And if you look at the Constitution, Article 1, the first branch of government, is Congress. There's a reason why CEI every 2 years puts out an agenda for Congress. And there's also a reason why every 4 years we do not put out an agenda for the president. And most of the document, which is online at CEI.org, we are, of course, here today to celebrate its release. All of those are about different facets of regulation. Sean works on labor policy. Iain Murray is going to talk about trade policy, all the other areas we cover. We need to pay more attention to regulatory policy writ large. It's a way for Congress to act. It's a way for it to reassert itself in the balance of powers and make for a much healthier approach to not just the current moment, but making us more resilient against whatever future crises might come our way. And part of that approach is that it's not enough to get rid of this or that regulation. Yes, it's important that the FDA loosened up its rules so that instead of an average of 10 years and $1.3 billion for a single new drug to come to market, the COVID vaccines took about a year to come to market, and millions of people are already getting inoculated for a disease that emerged for the first time less than 2 years ago. It's important that telemedicine bans were done away with, that certificate of need laws were done away with. At the state and local levels, it's important that restaurants no longer needed permits to serve their full menu or to serve delivery. All these little victories at all levels of government, I think 800 of these regulations related to COVID were done away with. And a good rule of thumb that we've been pushing at CEI over the last year is that if a regulation isn't needed during a pandemic, it was probably never needed in the first place. But the larger issue is systemic. If we don't shore up the rulemaking process itself, a lot of those rules are just going to come back and then some, especially when the executive branch is as powerful as it is today. So permanent reform requires Congress to act. It's not often I actually say that, but I think this is a case where it is. Senator Paul, who was kind enough to give his remarks earlier, spoke about a bill called the Reins Act. This would require Congress to hold a vote on all major new regulations coming from the executive branch. Because regulatory agencies, when they issue major new rules, they're supposed to do so as directed by legislation that Congress passed. That doesn't always happen. Sometimes they subvert the intent of the legislation. Sometimes they come up with major new rules out of the blue. This adds another check against the executive, which is important to have. President Trump issued an executive order to require agencies to post guidance documents in a single centralized location. Guidance documents are essentially guides to interpreting regulation that courts often use. These often have the force of law, yet they do not go through the rulemaking process that other rules must go through, nor does Congress act on them at all. This would at least provide some transparency to that. That executive order, to my knowledge, is being done away with, but there's a bill from Congress called the GOOD Act, the Guidance Out of Darkness Act. This would restore that check. There are other reforms we need. But I also think it's important to pass, or to at least introduce other bills, even if they have no chance of passage. Because who knows when the political moment will be right to pass them. It's important to have those jars on the shelf and at the ready. It's important to have a conversation piece to talk about ideas, to talk about a healthier separation of powers, to talk about the fact that institutions matter, that it's not enough to get rid of this that bad regulation. You have to fix the system itself. You have to treat the root problem. And our agenda for Congress is filled with all manner of ideas, whether it's energy and environment policy, tech policy, antitrust policy, labor and trade, which we're also discussing today. And while there's a lot of short-term pessimism around, a lot of which I share, I'm also a long-term optimist, and Senator Paul touched on this in his remarks. But as we recover from COVID, now that the light is at the end of the tunnel, I'd like to think back to a previous, much worse pandemic, smallpox. Smallpox was detected for the first time in ancient Egypt in the 3rd century BC. It was not until 9th century China, over a millennium later, that inoculation was used for the first time. And even then, that didn't do away with the disease, which, unlike COVID, had a 30% mortality rate. And unlike COVID, it didn't affect the elderly most severely, it affected the young. 800 years later, inoculation had slowly spread over to Ottoman Europe. And there, a woman named Lady Mary Wortley Montagu was one of the first to inoculate her family and spread the practice to Europe. Abigail Adams here in the United States inoculated her family against smallpox. Now, keep in mind that we did away with COVID, we'll do away with COVID in about 2 years. Smallpox wasn't eradicated fully until 1977. That disease had about a 2,200-year lifespan. We're getting rid of COVID in a year and change. This is progress. This is why, despite being a short-run pessimist, I'm a long-term optimist. And I think the ideas in our agenda for Congress and the importance of treating institutions as well as individual rules can do a lot to make us much more resilient against the next crisis, whatever that's going to be. Thanks.
Thank you, Ryan. Let me turn to Iain Murray, who, in addition to his own research, helps us think through these macro questions. Ian's done a lot of work on trade, which Ryan alluded to, the transfer of knowledge across geography and through time. Iain, why is it that we need to have trade on our policy agenda? And what is uniquely special about it as it relates to the United States Congress? Mute button. Iain, I believe you're on mute. It wouldn't be a Zoom meeting without.
Of course it would not. I've been so good. but thank you, Kent. And to answer your question, I think if there is one area where Congress has a choice to make where it can decisively turn its back on dysfunctional policy, it is trade. The Constitution, as you alluded, explicitly gives Congress, not the president, the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations. Congress has over the years, however, as Ryan described, delegated its power to the president. As in so many other areas, it is time for it to reclaim that delegated power. There are several reasons for this. The most important is to prevent the normalization of the Trump era's dysfunctional trade policy. President Trump's trade policy was based on the idea that free trade had hurt American communities in the heartland. Yes, heartland communities were and are suffering, but blaming trade is missing the wood for the trees. Trade, as it turns out, is responsible for just a small fraction of the number of jobs lost every year. Most jobs are lost due to the churn of innovation and the replacement of failing firms with newer ones. Changing tastes, such as Americans just stopping smoking, also cause large numbers of jobs to be lost. We do not, generally, and should not view this normal churn as a crisis. What we should be concerned about, however, is if we restrict the ability of Americans to rebound when this churn occurs. That's what happened. The harm caused to American communities attributed to trade job losses is really caused by regulatory and tax barriers to adaptation. Business startups and economic dynamism in general were badly hurt by the excessive regulation and high taxes of the Obama era. The last administration tried to reverse this and was successful up to a point. However, that administration negated a lot of this good policy because it blamed the problems caused by this regulation on trade. For every community seemingly helped by the Trump trade policy, many more were hurt. Soybean farmers found themselves with nowhere to sell their products, and so became dependent on new agricultural welfare programs. The truckers who moved the soybeans also found themselves out of work. The steel tariffs, and I'll come back to steel soon, helped cause the decade-long upward trend in manufacturing to stall out. It's not for nothing that our colleague at the Cato Institute, Scott Lincoln, had this slogan printed on a t-shirt. It's very catchy. Tariffs not only impose immense economic costs, but also fail to achieve their primary policy aims and foster political dysfunction along the way. So Congress's #1 job when it comes to trade should be to stop the normalization of the Trump trade policy. President Biden could end the steel tariffs at the stroke of a pen, but the steelworkers' unions have persuaded him not to. This is foolish. My daughter is at this very moment interviewing for a co-op work placement at a steel firm in Iowa. That steel firm is a joint Norwegian-US firm and imports much of its raw materials from its partner plants in Norway and Finland. The steel tariffs have disrupted its supply chain, imposing economic costs on it and its customers. If the president will not lift these tariffs, then it is Congress's job to instruct him to do so. Indeed, we recommend that Congress should go further and reclaim certain powers from the president. Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962 and sections 201 and 301 of the Trade Act of 1974 give the president too much discretion to impose tariffs on an allegation of a national security threat, as determined by the Department of Commerce, not the Department of Defense. Congress should repeal these sections or at the very least constrain the president's powers more than they are now. Congress taking such action would not only, as Ryan suggested, reassert the constitutional principle of separation of powers, but would provide an economic stimulus without any need for public spending. It would have supply side effects that have been proven time and time again to benefit the economy. And it would promote beneficial relationships with our allies, which is a supposed centerpiece of the new president's foreign policy. Indeed, if we are to hope to restrain the bad actors in Chinese trade, and there are some without any shadow of a doubt, we will need these allies to help provide a united front. China has been able to play off the European Union against the United States in the last year, for instance. This needs to change. Congress will also have to debate fast-track trade promotion authority again this year. It should instruct the president in this law to seek re-entry into the Trans-Pacific Partnership, to finalize a trade deal with the UK and start genuine free trade negotiations with the EU. It would be best if Congress were to recommend the trade deals will be based on a principle of mutual recognition of regulation rather than an attempt to harmonize regulation across borders. I will note that if President Trump had concluded a trade deal with the UK based on mutual recognition, then the life-saving AstraZeneca Oxford vaccine would already be available for use over here. Instead, we have 30 million doses sitting in a warehouse awaiting FDA approval. Finally, I will say that although free trade gets a bad rap, it actually rates as one of the best tools to aid developing countries there is. Senator Paul made this very clear. The Copenhagen Consensus Center found that simply finishing the Doha round of trade talks that were aimed at opening up the developed world markets to developing world products will provide $1,500 worth of benefits for every dollar spent, much of that accruing to the developing world. That's a benefit to cost ratio you just don't see in public policy. It would be particularly appalling to see the reverse done, using climate or environmental policy as a means to restrict trade with developing countries. But some in the president's orbit have suggested exactly that. So for the benefit of American consumers, American workers, our allies, and the developing world, Congress should reclaim its trade authority and return to the liberal trade agenda that helped the world recover from the Second World War and lifted billions out of poverty. That, I think, would be a legacy for congressmen to be proud of.
Iain, I just want to tie this back to what Senator Paul started with. What you're describing for a trade agenda, even when you go way down in the weeds for our audience, they can read more about this. They can download the whole book from our website. When you go way down on the weeds with Section 232 and the Trade Promotion Authority, is Congress taking action in order to make room for entrepreneurial activity, in order to make room for private actors to cooperate and sign contracts? It's not Congress doing things and directing things and spending money on things. It's getting out of the way so that the rest of America, productive sectors of the economy, where we live and work and play, those areas can do the hard work of lifting everyone into renewal. Am I understanding that right? It's a central question of how we make decisions.
Absolutely. There's a reason that the trade debate used to be about barriers to trade. That's precisely what you're talking about. The American who makes something and wants to sell it overseas, or the American who wants something but at the most affordable cost. If trade has barriers in it, then those wants and desires just don't occur. So trade talks have always been about removing barriers to trade. There's a reason why in the language of international trade, regulation is known as technical barriers to trade, TBT. If regulation in many ways is trade's biggest enemy these days, or at least it was before tariffs suddenly reappeared from nowhere. We need to think about regulation in the same way that we think about tariffs, barriers to trade. If we can reduce those barriers through principles such as mutual recognition, then more Americans will be able to sell what they produce to a global market, not just the American market. And Americans, consumers, get the benefits of that global market, being able to get the best products from the best places at the most reasonable price. And that's essentially the mechanism by which we increase prosperity. Just simply allowing that process to happen.
For the next question from our audience, I'm going to turn to Ryan and maybe take you out of your comfort zone as an economist, but ask you about law. Gerald poses the following: are we ceasing to have a rule of law? President Biden does not enforce existing laws, and here he cites immigration, and he cancels authorization of previously given activities like the Keystone Pipeline, causing financial damages to the industry and downstream to consumers in those markets. So Ryan, let me ask you, do we have a rule of law? And are there provisions, you referenced early the separation of powers, are there provisions in this work that speak to buttressing our rule of law here in America?
We do have rule of law, but it's not what it should be. And there's a lot we can do to improve it, much of which is actually in the agenda. Some of the policies he's referencing, pipelines and things like that, those sorts of policies ebb and flow depending on which party is in power. It's almost like a yo-yo, as one party and then the other alternates in power. That's not healthy. And that's one reason why Congress needs to be more involved in legislating. Congressional law is, for all intents and purposes, permanent. Few things are harder to undo, whereas an executive order can be and usually is undone the next time there's a party change. That's not healthy for the rule of law. There's also a so-called fourth branch of government, that's the administrative state. Agencies pass about 3,000 new regulations every year. The total cost of these is about $1.9 trillion, which is coincidentally the same figure as the COVID spending bill that just passed. That amounts to almost $15,000 per household. Congress did not pass many of these rules. The 185,000-page Code of Federal Regulations has about 1.1 million individual regulatory restrictions. Congress does not have time to pass all of these things. A lot of that happens at the agency level. And as these, which are not under congressional control, ebb and flow with each new administration, with every change of power, yeah, there is a lack of stability and an erosion of the rule of law. And as time goes on and as Congress continues to delegate away its proper responsibilities, that is a deep cause for concern. And that's one reason why I so strongly emphasize the importance of institutions, not just rules, but the rulemaking process itself. This is central to our way of government.
Before we wrap up, Sean, I want to ask you to address, I think, an idea that was underpinning a lot of what you had to say. Americans are looking ahead. It's springtime. We've seen the development and now the deployment, haltingly, but now the deployment of vaccines. People are eager to find that new balance in their life, whether it's going to be normal or not. We're looking ahead. And it seems to me that much of what you're describing is a question about whether or not we will have flexible and adaptive labor and employment law, or things that are restrictive and prescriptive for the way people are allowed to work and hire. Is that the best framing to understand the proposals that are coming down the pike? Or is there a better way that you use to think through the different laws and regulations that cross your desk day after day?
I think you're on the right track. I generally view the debates and the issues as a question of collective rights versus individual worker rights. The problem with a lot of the discussion and debate around these issues is whenever it's a labor or union related proposal, that itself is proposed as being a workers' rights or an advancement for workers' rights. The PRO Act is often described this way in a lot of reporting and commentary. But in fact, it's about collective rights versus against individual rights. And there's always going to be a tension and an issue between those. Socialism, has Senator Paul talked about thuggery, and that's at the far end of the extreme. But the very problem with socialism is the collective nature. It only works when everybody gets on board. And therefore, there's this tendency to pass laws and regulations that limit the individual rights of people, requiring them to sort of get on board with the program. When in fact, we need to preserve and protect individual rights because that is the foundation of liberty. And it's important also for the economy, because that's how new ideas, entrepreneurialism comes in. That's how people are able to adapt to their own circumstances. And so the issue, I think, is properly understood as a debate and a struggle over individual rights, the ability of the dissenter, the doubter, the iconoclast to go their own path, and collective rights. And you do need to have bias, I believe, in favor of the individual rights, because that is where the experimentation comes from. That's where people are able to, advance their own goals and their own priorities. And the problem is that it is not commonly understood as a debate between those two things.
Iain, I'm going to ask you to help us wrap up the program. We have an entire book divided into 10 sections of concrete policy proposals that can be investigated, brought up, debated, and ultimately introduced as legislation. I am delighted that today's program, we saw an awful lot of .gov email addresses in the registration. We created this program, or this project, for Capitol Hill, the 10,000 or so people who work there every day trying to shape the laws of this nation. What is it that you want that part of our audience to take away from today's program and the agenda for Congress?
Well, I'm always very sympathetic to those who work for government. I worked for government myself in the United Kingdom. I was a civil servant at the Department of Transport, which became the Department for Transport, which is very interesting, for about 10 years. And so I have every sympathy with people who are attempting to manage the regulation of industries as they have been instructed to do by Congress, often in a very haphazard and sometimes contradictory way. So what I would like to say is that if Congress follows the ideas that we lay out in the agenda for Congress, in Free to Prosper, then your job will become easier, because the need to micromanage and to regulate everything just disappears. If we are able to live in a free society where markets are the primary arbiter of of how prosperity grows, rather than government, then the job of the government becomes easier, the job of the entrepreneur becomes easier, the job of the consumer becomes easier, because they have so much choice, they're not forced down a certain road, and life becomes much more prosperous for all concerned. That's why we entitled our volume Free to Prosper. We want to make your job easier. We want to make the consumer's job easier. We want to make the entrepreneur's job easier. And I think that if Congress follows our advice, that will happen.
Very good. I want to thank you all. And again, for our audience, the book is available at our website this morning. Appreciate the remarks at the top of the program from Senator Paul. If you have additional questions or want to know more about what we're doing at CEI, please join us via our website, where all of the programs are available, as well as notices about future activities at cei.org. Our next event will be on Thursday, the 25th. We'll be back to our regular time of day at noon. I'll be hosting a double book forum with CEI Julian Simon awardee Johan Norberg and the co-founder of Greenpeace, Patrick Moore. Together, they'll be discussing their recent books on human progress and environmental risk. Open, the story of human progress, as well as fake invisible catastrophes and the threats of doom. I'm looking forward to that and hope to see you there. Thank you all. And that's it for today's program.